put this up again. Good morning. First slide, please. Wonderful. There it is. Nice background colour. Go to the next one straight away. I'll say a little bit about myself. Has anyone seen this poster? This is in the latest issue of the Australian Geographic, Dick Smith's Ecology magazine. And we get this in Germany. I live in Munich. For 20 years I've lived in just south of Munich. And I love it, so I thought I'd just put it there while I talk about myself. So background, so you know where I'm coming from. I was born in Westmead, raised in Westmead, Maryland's Parramatta area, went to Parramatta High School, attended universities in Sydney, did my postgraduate study in Brisbane, Griffith University, and then went to Germany to do postdoc studies and stayed, and got married to have kids, and in a bilingual household, by the way, and they love Australia. We come out every now and then. So I've been really in the academic world heavily, you know, all the degrees and all the research. If you want to look at my books, I've got a sampling back here near the stairs on the right side. So several of my books, and I'll be referring to those books in this talk. So if you want to get an idea of where I'm coming from, I'm a political scientist, not a politician, a political scientist, sociologist, that sort of thing, and I research society, and I research it from the point of view of human nature. My starting position is we have a human nature. Go to the next slide, please. It's not all that clear, is it? I can read it to you. You can read that? Now this is the end point of my talk, so anyone who wants to get a cup of tea after this slide, you can just go. But so you know, careful, so you know where I'm going with this. What I'll be arguing, what I'll be concluding, is that a lot of our problems at the intellectual level come from the wholesale ignoring of human nature in our universities, in sociology, in political science, in anthropology. And this has been happening, the process has been underway for a century, but especially in the post-World War II era. Now, whether or not one believes that human nature is created, or whether you believe it evolved, that's my own position, I'm an evolutionist, but the fact is, you can set that aside. The fact is we have a human nature. If you believe we have a human nature, God-given or evolved, how can one ignore human nature in studying such things as, and each of these topics overseas, there's an active research underway to understand ethnicity and race, obviously immigration would come into that, reproduction, you know, how babies are made, gender and sexuality, including homosexuality, by the way, childhood, development, family structures, okay, family dynamics, even literature, art. You can't really get a grip on that unless you understand what we are as human beings. This is my end point. And my own original specialty was power, hierarchy, and politics. I studied this as a core of political science. And this absence, this expulsion of human nature from the universities is most pronounced in anthropology. Not all of anthropology, but a large slice of it. All of sociology, almost, 99%, politics, literary theory, and philosophy. That's what I'll be ending. And what we'll be doing now, what I'll be going through now, is giving an example of the pathology, the intellectual pathology of ignoring human nature. Next slide, please. That's why you couldn't read it. Now you can read it. Now I'll give an initial example that's local. It's the University of Western Sydney. This has campuses in Bankstown, in Penrith, and elsewhere. It serves a huge population of Western Sydney, and I spent a day going through their website looking for examples of human nature being ignored. And that's what I'll be, and I'm giving you one example. I have an earlier, in my visit to Australia, I did a full analysis, or fuller analysis. But here's just one example, and it's from the course, Children and Community in the Social Sciences. Okay, so next slide, please. Now, this is not me talking. This is a quote taken from the university's official website, which describes the course. Let's read it. This is an excerpt. Comparative studies of families and kinship, a very important subject, by the way. Families are at the heart of our society. They're the core social unit that we have, the core bond, how children are raised. The familiarity of family life will be thrown into question. Students will be asked to examine their beliefs, decode the meaning, and discard the myths of the naturalness of family life. Let's get a grip on that for a moment. The family is not natural. Now think about that. Especially, let's come down. The nuclear family, the historical specificity in red, the historical specificity of the nuclear family. Now, what is this thing, the nuclear family? Oh, that defines the West. Did you know that? That defines Western core civilizational values. They're telling us it's just like all the others. It's all relative. It's all relative. Nuclear family, the love between a father and a mother, and love between the parents and the children, and the relationships that go on, and the instinctive behaviours we have, whether it be created or evolved, to fit into a family. That's what science reveals. This is completely ignored. This is a lie. This is a lie. 8,000 students are subjected to these sort of courses that I go through. The university has 24,000 students enrolled, and many of them, thank heavens, many of them are not subject to this. They're engineering students. They do agriculture, these sorts of things. But any one of the large number of students who wants to become a teacher, who wants to teach history or participate in, in high school curricula, will have to do this sort of nonsense. Now, this is an example. I'll be moving away from this and talking about immigration for the rest of my talk. But this just shows how broad this problem is. Next slide, please. Now, the reason I'm here really is because an article I wrote in Quadrant Magazine. This is a conservative, our most illustrious conservative intellectual magazine in Australia. Quadrant, I think it was begun in 1960 or something. It was an anti-communist magazine originally, and then now it's you know about Quadrant, and so, who was? Coleman, and now, yeah, it's Keith Winshuttle, who's the new editor, and I was really surprised he published my article. What my article was about was a criticism of an article in the Sydney Morning Herald, and this was written by a high-profile law professor from Melbourne, with international, he's famous guy, Professor Berghe, and he wrote this article, and my family was saying, Frank, calm down, because I was over breakfast and I was like, what? Because I happen to be an expert, because I've studied these things and published on it extensively. I happen to know some of the facts pertaining to what Professor Berghe was saying. What he was arguing for was, listen, we should simply open our borders. Every wealthy society, every Western society, should simply open its borders. Why? Because that would be good for the immigrants. I'm serious. Let's go through his argument. Rights are universal. Well, I agree with that. Everyone's precious. Everyone should have basic rights. We care about humans because they're human. Yeah, that's true. But there's inequality in the world. Therefore, it's immoral to regulate immigration. And we should keep the borders open until wealth is equalised. You know what he's saying, don't you? Not until they come up, until we come down to the standard. Okay, so I got furious and I began looking into it, and I found that there was broader support for this. Not one letter of criticism came from an academic. There was no uproar. He was not upbraided. He was not criticised. There were some letters to the editor from normal citizens who just said it's rubbish, and they were correct. They tore it to shreds. Not one academic. Next slide, please. Okay, and blink. Yep. Now, one criticism I made was he didn't discuss the costs of diversity. This word's a big one, isn't it? We've all heard, oh, diversity, let's have more of that. It's become a mantra. In fact, the scientific study of diversity shows, yes, it has some benefits. They're not hard to find, like restaurants. I love going to different sorts of restaurants. Do we need to have, 10 million immigrants to bring us some nice restaurants? No. In fact, I've even heard that even English cooks can learn to use curry. John Cleese can do it. If John Cleese can do it, others. Let's go through it now. We go to the cost side. There's the benefit side. Let's go through some of the costs. Inequality, big time. I mean, big time inequality. And the worst, most disgusting kind of inequality, where you have racial and ethnic groups stratified. Some rich, some poor, some very poor, some underclass. Like in America, the poor, fragmenting, collapsing United States of America, which in our own, some people here lifetime, we will see brought low because they failed to grasp some of these facts. Reduced democracy. And this is in some of the chapters of these edited books I have at the back here. As diversity increases, democracy comes under pressure. There are reasons for it. For example, people, just as we were hearing, people think in terms of their own community more, our own tribe, my own people, and they lobby for them, not as individuals. That's our tradition. I really liked your talk. This is really useful. It cuts my speaking time. Slows economic growth. Now, isn't this strange that we would have support for increasing diversity when it slows economic growth? Why? Because government decisions are less rational. Why are they less rational? Because they're trying to please different constituents. We must please the Muslims. We've got to please the Chinese. We can't offend China. We've got to please this group. Instead of thinking, what's good for the economy, they're thinking, we've got to help this group. And why is that necessary? Because when you have a diverse society, you have this group inequality. So you have some poor groups that are really poor, some really wealthy. It creates problems for economic growth. Lower social cohesion. Risk of civil war and conflict. After lack of democracy, there are well-known predictors of civil war. The strongest predictor is lack of democracy, because people can sort things out with democracy. When you take democracy away, you tend to have greater risk of civil war. The next strongest predictor is diversity, and the correlation is so clear. It's like this: increasing diversity, decreasing cohesion, decreasing feeling of community, increasing civil war. More corruption. Corruption increases because people are thinking, not as individuals, they're thinking more and more, what's good for my community, what's good for my family. Lower foreign aid. Now here's a funny one. The left supports diversity. It's their mantra. We want more and more diversity. And yet some of the costs of diversity are bad for left values, aren't they? Like, I thought the left supported foreign aid, but foreign aid goes down with diversity. Surely they're not in support of corruption, but it increases corruption. They're not in support of civil war, are they? The left? I thought these were nice people. More civil war, lower social cohesion. In fact, let's go to the next slide. This is interesting. And just blink through make it white. I've done 2 books, edited books, where we had international conferences, and then we published the papers. This is the first one, and this will looks in some detail at some of these issues. Now, people talk about the joy of multiculturalism, the joy of diversity. Here are some of the costs. There are some benefits, which should be fair on the benefit side. When people are in the ethnic minority, they feel more solid, more cohesive, more kinship feelings with their minority group than they do for the rest of the community. It's normal, by the way. The strongest racial and ethnic feeling is among minorities. That's well known in sociology. Funny, because it's the majority that are always accused of racism. It's funny, isn't it? The majority are the bad ones, but in fact, the majority, they're pretty benign. And the result is that they can undertake all sorts of risky transactions, good or bad, risky transactions, good business things, like business is inherently risky. So you find being in the minority helps you do business your group against the majority. And the classic form of that is ethnic middleman trading groups. See the third point there. And there are some classic examples of this. For example, Chinese in Southeast Asia are remarkably successful. They're 1% of the Philippine population, and they control 70% of the corporate economy. They're 1% of the Indonesian population, control 70% of the corporate economy. They run the Malaysian economy. They're 20% of the population. They just run the Malaysian economy. Singapore is basically Chinese with some Indian as well. Very successful. I have great respect for Chinese work ethic and intelligence. My point is a different one, though. It is that they're an example, a classic example of an ethnic middleman trading group where they help each other tremendously. Another example is Indians in Western Africa, until they were all expelled by Idi Amin and others, but they were successful. And there are many other examples. Good on them. I'm not criticising this is honest business behaviour. The point is a higher one, which is notice the cohesion, notice their ability to work against and compete against the majority business community. Okay? So from their point of view, it's very good, but from our point of view, it's not so good because we're the majority. It also is, and this is based on trust. So as a community is more homogeneous, trust grows, trust increases. And as diversity in a community grows, the trust remains in the small ethnic communities, they remain trustful, but trust is destroyed, it's undermined in the broad community. Is that what we want? It's also the basis of minority ethnic groups and nations are also the basis of national resistance movements and a lot of terrorism. You know that suicide bombing began in Sri Lanka, for example, years before it began in the Middle East. And the Tigers in the north, they were an ethnic-based, religious-based resistance movement fighting for their independence from the south of the island, and they began using suicide bombing, suicide terrorism with strapped-on, devices. Next slide, please. So what I'm doing is getting inside some of these processes, just to give you a hint of some of the processes at work. And notice that it all involves, it all starts from an understanding of human nature. What I'm describing is not monstrous, it's human nature at work. And we can understand the minority, we can understand different actors if we understand human nature. It doesn't mean what they're doing is good, it just means that it's from human nature. That's a book cover on the right, the welfare books up here. We did a second study on welfare, unemployment benefits, old age benefits, health benefits, where the state steps in and helps people in need, and also does some damage, of course, if it's too generous in some regards. And I began by doing a study of begging. Begging, please. Can you give me? And I began photographing and talking to beggars around the world whenever I travelled. And we did a quantitative test of my theory of begging in Moscow. And we had a colleague did a wonderful study, and what they found was the people who give most generously to beggars belong to their own ethnic group. That's hardly a surprise, but it was never done before, never proven before. So someone's sitting on the side begging, and if they're ethnic Russian, and an ethnic Russian walks by, gives money. If the person's begging gypsy, very difficult. They don't get so much money, they have to really beg hard. Another gypsy will give, and so on. So, it works by gradation. So people give more to a beggar who's from a different ethnic group, but a bit closer. Right? So it's very interesting. And then that applies to welfare rights. Now here's something interesting. Again, the left supports generous welfare. It's a no-brainer, clear, right? They represent the poor, needy people in society. This is how they present themselves. And they're fighting for their welfare. But the left also supports unlimited immigration to Western societies, and diversity undermines welfare. As diversity goes up, welfare goes down. Why? People just don't feel as generous. They want to give to the people who are like them. They want to give to people who could be their own child, or their own mother, or their own grandmother, or their own brother or sister. That's just human nature. That's how people feel. And it works to the religious level too. People feel most comfortable and spontaneous giving within their religious communities. And if you diversify a society religiously, or you diversify it ethnically, the effect is lower welfare. What is the left doing? What it's doing is it's not rational. The universities have been living a lie in sociology, political science, anthropology for generations now, and now we're seeing that we're reaping the effect, because you can avoid reality, but it will catch up with you. Great talk again. It will catch up with you, and it's catching up with us because the left is shooting itself in the foot, and shooting us in our foot as well, which I don't like. Economic growth suffers, public goods suffer, and foreign aid suffers, which I said before. Just to touch on trust. A famous Harvard professor of political science has done a study. I'll think of his name in a moment. Has done a study a few years ago where he showed that as diversity increases, trust goes down. I mean, general trust, whether you trust your shopkeeper, whether you trust your politicians, just general trust goes down. In other words, society fragments. Next slide, please. Now back to this great poster. There's a point to this. Can anyone see an Asian there? So, what? On the Qantas plane. Maybe who made the Qantas plane. Now, this struck me. Sorry? Oh, it's a Muslim plane. So I was looking at that, and this is the core of this poster, where you can spot out it could be Don Bradman, the blonde surfer girl. Then we've got a gold panner there with his, and we've got an aviatrix, a famous aviatrix. We've got the original bronzed Anzac, surf lifesaver holding the flag, and we have, I think, a convict, a blonde convict. Then we have Mawson, the Antarctic explorer, English Australian. He migrated from England to Australia, and then we have a Gallipoli soldier. Now, I sincerely believe that this poster was put together to represent Australian identity icons of what we think we are as a people, what the Australian nation is. Historically, you can see it's historical. There are some Aboriginals there, but they've always been recognised, it's been understood that we have an Aboriginal minority. Now, what if they'd been politically correct? What would they have done? Well, I suppose the bronze digger could have been African. I suppose the Anzac there on the left, the Anzac soldier, could have been a Chinaman, because that would reflect the reality on the streets that we see around us in Melbourne and Sydney and elsewhere. Here's my point. My point is there's a huge yawning gulf between our national identity, how we think of ourselves just automatically, and by the way, how the world thinks of ourselves. So that in Europe, this is how they think of us, and the reality we see around us. Next slide, please. So the demographic facts on the ground are at odds with national identity. I don't think that's a problem at the present time. There are some flashpoints, but basically it's kept under control because our elite is indoctrinated with since World War II, the analysis of national identity and the nationhood and so on has been dominated by Marxists, multiculturalists and internationalists. Okay? This has had an impact on immigration policy, which you can see around you. Next slide, please. This growing gulf between, and here's what I call latent fragmentation. Latent means it's potential. It's not here now, but it's a growing tension between the reality and our dream of what we are, or imagining of what we are. So here's some of the gulf. Here's some of the tension between our identity and the reality of the population, between country and city. If you go to a country town, it could be 1950. Okay, there might be a Chinese restaurant, but that's fine. No one objects to that. But it could be Australia 1950, 1960, like this picture we just saw, like the poster. And then I was talking to someone from Bathurst. She was on the train together. I met this lady, we got talking. And she just shook her head in amazement and said, "It's so sad when I go into Sydney, it's so sad." That was her opinion. I'm just reporting how she felt. That's her. What do they say in business, in retailing? The customer is always right. In democracy, basically, the customer is all... She just said, "It's so sad. It's just not my country anymore. I go back to Bathurst and I'm in Australia again." Divide between country and city, between old and young, because older Australians remember how it was just yesterday. They remember, so it's created a divide. And significantly between professionals and non-professionals, because our professional class is being flooded by hard-working people. No criticism of them, they're doing well. Chinese and Vietnamese and so on. Okay, they're doing their best, but I'm just describing the reality, which is the professional classes are becoming alienated from the masses. And this is about to hit us, and I'll tell you why about. Because when I come to Australia, I like to turn on television and flick around. I do that anyway. I flick around, and it could be 1950. The faces I see, the hair colour I see, the accents I see, these, except for SBS. We'll put SBS aside. But basically, the commercial channels... our movie stars, the people we see on our sitcoms on television, it could be 1940, actually. It's remarkable. Now, that can't go on forever. People are going to notice that the great majority of their doctors are not from their own ethnic group, and so on. So I think we're in a bit of trouble here. Can I have the next slide? And this creates risks, and I'll quickly run through it. It's pretty obvious. I think that stability is maintained, that we haven't got these risks right now, or rather we haven't got the reality of really nasty situation, because the media suppresses it, the educational establishment, the universities and high schools suppress it, and both political parties don't want to talk about it, because they have an interest in getting votes from ethnic minorities. But here are some of the risks of polarisation. Think of Pauline Hanson, the unbelievable phenomenon of this, simple lady who had tremendous courage, and she just made some speeches and said what many people wanted to say but were too afraid. Isn't that sad? Isn't that sad in modern Australia? Too afraid to say. And she achieved something like a national vote of 20%. That's my understanding. Her base level support was about 20%. This was in the face of media onslaught, university onslaught, elite onslaught against her. So, but that's a worry. And also Cronulla, the riot that actually began as a peaceful mass demonstration. This is the sort of thing that could become endemic if diversity is increased and relentlessly increased. What about Howard's Bennelong defeat? This is not talked about as the equivalent of Cronulla or Pauline Hanson, but it is. You know what happened? The person who defeated John Howard in Bennelong, in his electorate of Bennelong, Maxine McHugh, she wrote an article for the Sydney Morning Herald where she said, well, it happened largely because I got a block racial vote against Howard. Now think about that. She went to Mr. Rudd and she said, what do you think of my plan to use the racial ticket? She played racial politics, but it's okay because it's minority racial politics, of course. You couldn't go to people and say, if you're Anglo-Australians, vote in support of your own national survival. That would be racist, wouldn't it? Obviously. But if you say to Chinese, you'd be called a Hansonite. But if you go to Chinese and say, or Asians, and you say, look, Howard made some critical remarks in 1986 or 88. Vote against him because he said something was a bit nasty about Asian immigration a generation ago. Oh yeah, that's all right. So we have open racial politics from the Labor Party. Then loss of identity and cohesion. This is another risk, and I think this is actually happening. I think the resistance to building mosques is a healthy sign. I think it's a healthy sign. Now, it may not be nice for Muslims, I understand from their perspective, but from an Australian perspective, that's quite a healthy sign. What about communal polarisation and corruption? I think it's happening already. I think our loss of truth as a standard, this is what happens in really diverse societies, communal polarisation. And then the worst that can happen is endemic civil conflict, and of course democracy suffers. Democracy has been suffering for a long time in Australia. What was multiculturalism? What is this word? It means many fancy things, but actually what it means in concrete terms is where a political party says to an ethnic minority, we will give you money to build a community centre, we'll alter immigration policy so you can have family reunion, endless family reunion, and more of your people coming in if you vote for us. That's all, good. So it's a deal. It's a simple, rather low political deal that does not take into account the interests of Australia as a whole. It's corruption, multiculturalism, and need I mention the name Al Grasby, to a man who was complicit in a murderous mafia gang and who has a statue in the Labor Party headquarters in Queanbeyan, I think. Unbelievable. Next slide, please. And now this is a long quote, and I just wanted to put it there before you. This is Michael Walzer, is a famous Jewish philosopher in America. He's at the Princeton Institute of Advanced Study, so he's at the very top of American academe. And, you know, I don't agree with everything Walzer says, but this was one of his better articles, 1994, and he said, look, what he was doing was taking into account human nature. He was saying, actually, we all have the same nature, we all have the same needs. We want families, we want children, we want acceptance. We all belong to one tribe or another. And he said, tribalism. What is tribalism? It names a commitment of individuals to their own history, culture, and identity. Nothing wrong with that. And this commitment is a permanent feature of human social life. He means it's human nature, okay? Part of human nature. The parochialism, that means this loyalty to your tribe, the parochialism that it breeds is similarly permanent. Human nature is here to stay, folks. You don't change human nature. This is something the left just doesn't understand. They think you can just change it by changing the law. You can just do this and you abolish the nuclear family, and you have, you know, you can have gay marriages and all this sort of thing. Oh, well, just change the law. A little bit of propaganda, re-education, you've done it. You can't change human nature. It cannot be overcome. It has to be accommodated, and therefore the crucial universal principle is that it must always be accommodated. This is a clever guy. Not only my parochialism, but yours as well. Everybody's parochialism, because it's what we need to live. This anonymous mass culture where you sit watching the television and you're isolated from the people next door, you're just totally private lives. This isn't how humans live. We need communities. We need religious communities, ethnic communities, local council communities and so on. And this leads to one of my main criticisms of this Sydney Morning Herald article. What he said was that we must open our borders to anyone who wants to come in the world because we're wealthy and they're poor. Now hold on a moment, just hold on a moment. I don't mind people giving charity. Of course, we want to help people overseas, but that's no reason for us to forego our responsibility to our own people. And the analogy I use is the family. Now I'll put this to you as a theoretical question. Is it morally wrong for me to look after my children and make sure they've got a full tummy and they're in bed warm at night when there are other children starving in the world? It's a very important question. Is that immoral of me? That's what they say. This is a mainstream left perspective, that actually the nuclear family is immoral. This goes back, in utopian socialism, goes back 100 years or more, that the nuclear family is immoral. Why? Because you look after your children before you help other children, anywhere in the world. What are they implying? Children are interchangeable. Just because my wife gave birth to my child and that's our child genetically and biologically, hold on, that child should be no more special to me than a Bangladeshian or the child next door or whatever. Now, come on. These people are so vulnerable to critique. This is what disappointed me with this Sydney Morning Herald article, that no one wrote in and said, look, come on, what's this person doing teaching our young? What's he doing being paid $120,000 with extra costs and holiday loading by the Australian taxpayer? It's an outrage. Next slide, please. Okay, last slide. And I thought I'd just throw some ideas. These are very broad ideas and common sense, I know. But what's needed is these people need to be challenged at the highest level, and they can be challenged. It's not as if, and by the way, I'm not the only voice saying this. Overseas, in Britain, in the United States, you have far more diversity, far more acknowledgement of human nature in the social sciences than you have in Australia. In Australia, it's basically kept out with a couple of exceptions. They need to be criticised, and alternatives need to be presented. So you need alternative vision and criticism of the poison that's going on. Then you also need citizen activism for truth and balance. And notice that the high-level academic criticism would feed into, because then a normal citizen could say, look, we've got the truth, it's understandable, it's not hocus pocus, what you're teaching my children is wrong, you should change. So you could have direct, and this can have an impact, direct citizen action against university professors who teach this nonsense. And that needs to be directed at universities, and then everything else will percolate down. Because where do high schools get their curricula from? They get them from universities. So what we have is unfortunately a negative feedback. We have poison in the universities, which then trickles down to poison in our high schools. And what I think we must demand truth in teaching. And it's not good enough. There's no excuse for teaching lies. Absolutely no excuse. Thanks very much for your time. Could you go to the next?